for coming out and staying here in the rain. All right. Hi again, everyone. My name is Jamaal Abegaz, and thank you all for coming out to the first annual Fargo Moorhead Juneteenth celebration. Thank you to Birthing of a Diamond for hosting this event, and Lit Management for putting it on, and for hosting the community to come together and invite them to learn and celebrate this Juneteenth 2019 with their African American neighbors. And thank you for inviting me to speak today. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the original lands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. In this country, we commonly remark 1619 as the first time African slaves arrived in the English colonies, which would later become the United States. During those first 157 years of enslavement, there came to be nearly 500,000 enslaved African Americans throughout the 13 British, soon-to-be independent colonies. Enlightenment philosophy and the fervor for self-determination among these British colonists led to the adoption of the Declaration of Independence by the Second Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776. Therein lay a promise. The basic idea that, quote, we hold these truths self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, end quote. Yet after the flames of war died, the institution of slavery did not. And as the ink dried on the ratified Constitution of 1789, the blood-soaked institution of slavery did not dry up and blow away. Rather, its signing sought to embed the wretched concept that African Americans were to be considered 3/5 human. That union was favorable to upholding the basic principles of revolution in the eyes of those undersigned. And thus, the trade in human beings continued. It took nearly a decade before the young United States outlawed the international slave trade, but the domestic slave trade carried on. Even in Minnesota, where some slavers sought to vacation, in Stearns, in Benton, Hennepin, Ramsey, and Washington counties, there were African Americans brought here by folks like the Lowrys, the Hayes, the Calhouns. And though the abolitionist movement grew in size, influence, and power, it took another 53 years and a great war and a great final declaration for formal chattel slavery to end in the United States. Today, we're marking the final act of liberation in that great war. Juneteenth is the celebration of the culmination of the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a celebration of justice delayed, realized. The Emancipation Proclamation made by President Abraham Lincoln, issued on January 1st, 1863, declared as free the 3.5 million African American slaves in the treacherous southern states. Though at the time, only a small fraction of that number were liberated. As the war progressed, both black and white Union soldiers marched on, winning victories, which would bring liberation to all in that number, save 250,000 who remained enslaved by the rebel government in Texas, and the army stationed there protecting them. You see, Texas, which had been isolated during much of the Civil War and spared from most of the fighting, was seen as a safe haven by slavers, who, fearing the approaching Union armies, ran, taking the enslaved with them. On April 9th, 1865, the war was effectively over after the conclusion of the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse, and came with it the subsequent surrender of the bulk of the rebel forces. Though the largest rebel force in Texas was well aware of the defeat in Virginia on April 28th, the dissolution of the Confederacy on May 5th, and the surrender of rebel forces in Brownsville, Texas, those holdouts only surrendered on June 2nd. Finally, on June 19th, a day after Union forces arrived in Galveston, Texas, when General Order Number 3 was read, the people formerly enslaved celebrated in the streets, and the date became known as Juneteenth. As you can see, I think dates are important. We note on Juneteenth the long and unnecessary suffering of those who had to endure in shackles so long after this nation declared liberty for all as a right. Long after that right was again proclaimed during war, and long still after that war had ended in this nation's favor. We rejoice as those who endured, those who were able to endure, were only then able to savor the freedom that was their birthright. The freedom no one had to take from them, guaranteed by their existence, and freedom denied, realized. Their jubilation lives on through their descendants to this day. And yet, African American people were still enslaved. It wasn't until later that year, on December 18th, 1865, that the 13th Amendment was proclaimed ratified, that formal chattel slavery in the United States was abolished. It took 90 years after the claim of equality was made, and 247 years after the beginning of this human tragedy for Juneteenth to come for all 4 million plus African Americans. Jubilant as we are, it was clear then, as it is now, the promise remains unfulfilled. Though we celebrate, justice has been delayed. Indeed, built into the very text which was supposed to honor our natural rights was the substrate used to perpetrate our oppression further. As the practice of slavery was and is explicitly allowed in the context of criminal incarceration. Hereafter, it becomes abundantly clear in the history of this nation that lots of people have no intentions of completing the promise that I outlined. That the wretched concept had taken hold. Many people and the post-Civil War strides made by black people in business, education, and politics were all too quickly lost. And so the slave codes, which have formerly existed to keep us divided, illiterate, and in chains, were replaced in 1865 and 66 with the black codes, which were enacted by states, sought to control our labor, steal the franchise, keep us from bearing witness in court, in some cases dissuade us from living in northern states, made new crimes, such as vagrancy, or extended them so that they could be applied most efficiently to the new class of poor African American citizens, such that they were able to be arrested for merely existing, and through force of legal farce, placed back in the chains they had only so recently escaped. Of course, this didn't come easily or all at once. In 1866, the first federal civil rights legislation was passed, guaranteeing citizenship, and wary of a bigoted tyrant in the presidency, a more radical Congress moved to ensure that Reconstruction took place by force if necessary, and that rights guaranteed by the law, newly ratified by placing the rebel states under Union Army occupation. However, those rebel states were reamended. Ratifying the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, they were allowed to return. And the desire, if not the need, to hold these southern states to their word waned. Terrorism in the form of the KKK, as well as all sorts of both vigilante and government-sanctioned violence, was used in the immediate end and during the Reconstruction years and on into the Jim Crow era, which followed, to kill, maim, frighten, rob African American Southerners into compliance with this new iteration of racial caste system. I can tell that through all that misery, the ancestors bore us. They lived and lived their hopes and dreams into their children, and the promise of equality, which at that point was only spoken by those who were thought as radicals, continued through industrialization, segregation, economic calamity, 2 world wars, where though our ability to contribute was thought to be less, Our glory was more than the enemy could bear. And through to a Depression-era generation and another post-war generation, those hopes survived. The civil rights campaigns of the 20th century came to prominence, seeking the fulfillment of that promise. In that way, bus rides through the South, peaceful marches, the franchise, became the new proclamations to the recalcitrant racists as well as the African American Southerners alike that emancipation was to mean not only the end of bondage in fact, but also the end of bondage by law. Those liberators at that time looked as they did historically and as they do now. They look like all of us. And just like then, many liberators gave their lives for the promise. Movements led to laws, court rulings, which no longer permitted to maintain the caste system so explicitly. And like on the first Juneteenth we celebrated, the struggle paid dividends. And they knew it wouldn't change the world overnight. But minds did change. And bit by bit, conditions began to improve. But only so far. You see, those who had no intention of fulfilling the promise also passed their understanding of that wicked concept. That all who are not created equal in their progeny, or to their progeny. Those who benefited from the old caste system, from perceived status, through wealth acquired by stolen labor, found their continued comfort and power in maintaining that lie as if it was the truth. And they taught their children from generation to generation to hold it dear. This acquired power, which is sought and being used to divide racially, ethnically, and economically oppressed peoples, has been done with the specific intent to keep us from coming together, to force those races back once again. And so we're here today. In our days after war and economic calamity, finding that we own less, pay more, work harder, have less control over our lives, less ability to educate ourselves, are the subject of extrajudicial violence, are more segregated than we have been since the last time we rose up, we find that this is not what we wanted. Not what we expected to be 400 years on. We find that the promise has yet to be made. And so, as we celebrate this Juneteenth together, I impel you all, take the words from that first statement of principle, give them the full meaning, that all people are created equal, that all of us are entitled to the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Take that promise home, put it to work in your lives. Take it and share it with friends and family alike. Take that promise to work, to school, and hand in hand with your folks, stand fast until you have it in hand. Take that promise to the ballot box and to the streets to make those in power tremble before your voice as you demand the promise be fulfilled once and for all, as you demand equality. Thank you.